One of the ultimate goals of persuasion is to change behavior. But in order to change somebody's behavior, we need to work through psychological mechanisms. And so a lot of the research is focused on attitude. If we can change a person's attitude, that may end up changing their behavior. If they end up liking a product more, or liking a behavior more than they did before, liking a political candidate more than they did before, then they might, if they have a positive attitude towards these things, then they might be more likely to behave in a manner that we want them to behave, such as buying the product or voting for the candidate. And probably the most prominent model for doing this is a dual route model called the Elaboration Likelihood Model. And what this model is saying, when we talk about dual route, what the idea is that there are two paths that we could take through persuasion. And the difference between those paths is the amount of elaboration. Elaboration, in psychological terms, is the amount of cognitive effort that a person gives in tying information together, tying this incoming information to what they already know and making sense of it in order to form an opinion. So this model that I'm going to show you is a diagram from Media Effects, Advances in Theory and Research, second edition. There are later editions, but this was the diagram that I had on hand, and it still stands the test of time. The chapter within this textbook is the Mass Media Attitude Change, Implications of the Elaboration Likelihood Model of Persuasion by Petty, Priester, and Brignol. So let's take a look at the model. And this is the model in the book. The original authors are down here. The 1986 is about the time that this model was really being refined, and there's still probably refinements going on. So let's go through it. So you have a persuasion message. Maybe it's an advertisement, maybe it's a public service announcement just saying prevent forest fires. Whatever that persuasive communication is, the goal is to change a person's attitude in hopes of changing their behavior. So it's like message, attitude change leads to change in behavior is the overall idea of this model. And there are two big factors in whether a person is willing to elaborate on the message. We're going to have two different outcomes based on, do they elaborate? Do they think hard about the message, tie the pieces together, or don't they? There are other dual route models I'll mention, like the heuristic systematic model by Eagly and Chaikin, which predicts the same types of thing. They had a research agenda that was saying, okay, we also see dual routes. Either people are going to think about the message or they aren't. And that's the elaboration. How likely are people going to think about the message or not? How likely are they going to elaborate? And when we try to figure out, well, what might cause a person to elaborate on a message versus not? Well, the default, we could say, is not elaborating. I think it's Eagly and Chaikin who say that, in polite terms, that people are cognitive misers. I think about it like a trout in a stream, that if you don't have to swim against the current, your default, you're wasting energy, you're lowering your chances of survival. Whatever the case may be, our minds are sort of the same way, unless a person happens to have a personality trait like the need for cognition, where they just really want to keep thinking. By default, people just say, if I don't have to put in the work of thinking, I'm not going to put in the work. So when I make a decision about something, unless there's something that prompts me to want to elaborate more, I probably won't. And so you could say the default is the non-elaboration route. Probably we call that the heuristic route. I'm going to take mental shortcuts to make my decision. But if something sparks that interest that says, okay, this is worth thinking about, I need to put a little bit of effort into this, in that case, then people are going to be more likely to take the elaboration route. And in the Elaboration Likelihood Model, they've titled these two routes as the central route and the peripheral route. I'll start with the peripheral route. Peripheral route is where we could have an attitude change just without thinking very much about it. The central route is where if we put in the elaboration and we think about the message. Okay, so default would be more likely peripheral route unless something sparks us to want to take that central route and elaborate. So the question is, what might make a person want to elaborate? What might make them want to take the central route? And research is showing two big factors. One is, are they motivated to process the message? So here's the first block right here. Are they motivated? What do they want to think about this? And what might make them want to? And there are a number of factors, but two of the big ones would be, a really big one is personal relevance. If the message seems relevant to the person, then they're more likely to think about it. If they are in the market for a new car, their old car is breaking down, then an ad for a car shows up, then they might be more likely to, more motivated to think about it and say, oh, I'm going to pay attention to this. One of the classic experiments that was done was presenting, it was a fake scenario, but researchers went to classrooms at a university and said, we're thinking about doing some comprehensive exams. We're going to require everybody to pass an exam that tests you on a whole bunch of knowledge before you can graduate. And the students are like, all right, okay, you got my attention, this is relevant. But here's the manipulation. Some of the students, they told, this is going to affect you. You won't be able to graduate unless you do this. What do you think about this? All of a sudden, that proposal was highly relevant to them. Other students, they said, this, still is not likely to affect you. It'll go into effect after you graduate. All of a sudden, it becomes less relevant. And I made a note here that just saying, it's not necessarily a yes. I'm pointing at my computer screen, like you can see that. Here, I can do it with here. It's not likely just an entire yes or no, because you could be totally motivated or you could be totally not motivated. But there's middle ground. It's like, all right, I kind of want to think about this. Maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less. But in statistics and other reasons, it's, a lot of the experiments are just saying, let's do our best to separate these two channels, make somebody really motivated or somebody really not motivated. Either this is really relevant or not really relevant. So we kind of break it down into two routes just so we can see the differences between the two. And what they found with the research, in that study is, the students who said this is going to affect me, they thought about the messages differently. In this case, the strength of the argument made a whole lot more difference. If it was a weak argument for having the final or these comprehensive exams, the students who were motivated to think about it, that made a big difference. For the people who weren't motivated to think about it, it wasn't relevant to them. Relevance is the key here. Then they were like, weak argument, strong argument. It didn't have as much of an influence. They weren't as likely to think about it. So personal relevance, that's a key. If somebody asks you, hey, what makes a person want to take the central route or more likely to take the central route? Relevance. Another one I mentioned a little bit just a few minutes ago is need for cognition. So there are certain personality traits where some people just want to think about stuff. And so they might just be habitual central routers. I'm going to get a t-shirt that says, I'm a central router. And nobody will know what that means except for you. You're in the in crowd now. Okay, so assume that the message is relevant. It applies to you. It's like, I want to think about this. The second criteria is, do you have the ability to process the message? So the diagram here gives a couple of examples, like, are there distractions in the area? So maybe I really want to focus on this message, but I'm outside where I have a cat down by my feet. It's chasing bugs and birds. So maybe this cat is distracting me, and so I want to think about it, but I'm only half processing it. I'm trying to elaborate, but my elaboration mechanisms are kind of going in different directions. I want to say multitasking, but it's more like split attention. I can't process it very thoroughly. So I might have to take a mental shortcut to make my decision. Or maybe you're in a driving and you're focusing on the driving and there are distractions, and so you're listening to the radio ad, but you're also paying attention. you don't have the ability to think deeply about it. And these have implications for thinking about your audience. If you're designing a message, thinking about, okay, where are my people going to be? Are they going to be hearing this message in an area where they're going to have a lot of distractions, or are they going to be in an area where they can really focus on it? If I'm doing an ad for the radio where most of the people are probably going to be driving in drive time, then maybe I'll do an ad that doesn't require a whole lot of thought. Maybe I'll try to do other persuasive messages. Or maybe I'll simplify it. Maybe I know that they'll be interested, but they can only handle a limited amount of information. So I'm going to make a hard sell argument based on, a strong argument, but maybe I'll just limit it to one point. Which, if you've studied, advertising, that's oftentimes one of the strategies is, hey, make your ad limited to one strong point. And this helps explain why. Okay, so there are distractions. Repetition. Maybe if it takes a little bit of thought to do the central route thinking, people have to elaborate and think about it. Sometimes just one pass at the information isn't enough. It's sort of like when you study for an exam. You have motivation to want to study, but just hearing that lecture once isn't enough. You have to go back, take your notes, reread your notes. So in order to make that stick in memory so people can elaborate and think about it, maybe the message needs to be repeated enough times. And if it isn't, you went, oh, that was good information, but I didn't have enough time to think about it, then you might have to make your decision on based on heuristics, the peripheral route. Knowledge is another one. If I am talking about the benefits, maybe I go in and say, all right, high schoolers, you are being manipulated by advertising and persuasive messages all the time. As we know with the elaboration likelihood, you need to have more elaboration and not just rely on heuristics. And I'm making the strong appeal, and maybe they're relevant. They're like, oh yeah, I don't want to be manipulated. I want to think about this. But they have no idea what the ELM is, Elaboration Likelihood Model, or they don't have any idea of what heuristics are. Then again, they just don't have the ability to process it. So they're going to have to make decisions on mental shortcuts, kind of fill in the gaps. So, two criteria for being able to process the central route, be able to really elaborate. The motivation, is it personally relevant, or other factors? Do you have the ability, whether it's circumstantial or internally? Do you have that knowledge? Maybe you don't even have, critical thinking skills. Maybe I want to think about this, but I haven't developed critical thinking skills. Okay, if the answer to both of those questions, or I should say, if the answer to one or the other is no, then you have to take the peripheral route. You have to just do some mental shortcuts and reach your attitude change or your decision through that. So let's take a look at that. So motivated to process? Nah, I don't care. Or I'm motivated and I don't have the ability to? No. Then it says, is a peripheral process operating? For example, so what in the model or in the message might spark an attitude change? For example, do I identify with the source? Research says if the spokesperson in a message kind of forms this connection with me, I can identify with what they're talking about. I don't really understand, it's not a strong argument, but yeah, this looks like somebody like me or somebody I identify with. Then I might be persuaded a little bit. Or it says use of heuristics or balance theory. Balance theory, do they like the product? Do I like them? If they like the product and I like them, then maybe I will have a favorable attitude toward the product. Something like attractiveness. That research shows that attractive spokesmodels or spokespersons can have a persuasive effect. It isn't a strong argument. It isn't logical thinking about here's why you should buy the product. It's like, hey, person looks good. I have a favorable attitude. Kind of have a favorable attitude toward the product now. Maybe music can work that way too. Hey, happy mood. More like almost like classical conditioning. It's like, yeah, put me in a good mood. So that looks like good. It's like the crunch of Doritos. It's like, all right, strong argument, not really, but crunch sounds good about now. So if there's some kind of a cue in there that sparks something that makes me want to have a favorable attitude, or this can also work in a negative way. If maybe it's just a really annoying ad. I don't like the guy's voice. And it's, regardless of the argument, the guy's voice just bugs me. That could be a peripheral cue to have me change my attitude in a negative direction. So if there's a peripheral process operating, then peripheral attitude shift could happen. And that creates a certain kind of attitude. So the changed attitude is relatively temporary. It's not a strong, I didn't put a lot of thought in this. It's just sort of like, sounds good now or sounds bad right now, but something later could change my mind. I might lose that attitude. It's susceptible to counter persuasion. When somebody tells me, oh, you know what? That snack that you wanted, maybe you wanted the Crunch or Doritos, but really, Cheetos is, those little Cheetos, and when you get the shrunk ones, they look like little billy clubs. I had in the Air Force, I had a crew partner who, we had a bag of Cheetos, and he pulled out the little, not the big puffy ones, but the crunchy ones, and he'd pull out one that looked like a little club. He's like, my brother and I used to beat each other with these, like, pretend they were caveman clubs. It's like just something simple like that. I'm like, yeah, right, you're right. Let's get the Cheetos instead of the Doritos. So it's susceptible to counter persuasion. Likewise, a lot of priming effects and other effects that we see in media could just be, hey, I bought this product, or I'm interested in this product because the spokesperson just fit a stereotype of somebody who's smart. But then if somebody gives me the facts, it's like, yeah, but that computer that they're selling really isn't all that great. Maybe I can see through the stereotype and go, oh yeah, wait a second, that's just an actor. And I think through it. So it's susceptible to counter persuasion. It's just not a solid attitude. And it's unpredictable of behavior. So these kinds of attitudes that are kind of wishy-washy might not be strong enough to actually influence our behavior. The Doritos, I go to the store and I'm with the intention of buying, but then I see something else that distracts me and I buy that instead. I just wasn't set on it. So these are the kinds of attitudes that form through that peripheral route by using mental shortcuts, by using lack of thought. That's the kind of attitude change that happens. Okay, and again, that might be our default, where if we're not putting thought into something, we might sway in different directions, make impulsive decisions, but the attitude inside of us may not be strong. All right, and then again, if we go back to the diagram, if a peripheral process is not operating, if there's really nothing in the ad that persuades us, even through a peripheral route, then our initial attitude, whatever attitude we had about Doritos or the computer or the car, isn't changed. Now let's get central here. Time to stop, elaborate, and listen. Is that how it goes? Anyway, it's an old ice baby from 90s, 80s, something. If you have motivation to process and the ability to process, it's central time. I was going to say showtime. It's showtime. Then you think, well, what is the nature of the processing? And here's where we get into, now I'm going to examine the message. And this is, like I mentioned earlier, argument quality comes into play. If it's a weak argument or a strong argument, that matters now, because I'm going to be evaluating the pros and cons of that you give me. In that study about having the comprehensive exams, if they give flimsy reasons of, well, I don't remember from the research, but just off the top of my head, you could say, well, it's going to motivate students to try harder. It's going to look good for our program. It's what other universities are doing, and it just isn't very convincing. Then you're going to look at that, and it's actually going to, yeah, I'm going to have an attitude change toward this exam. I'm central route processing, and it's going to be a strong attitude, but it's going to be strongly unfavorable toward your exam. Whereas if I have a strong argument that makes good points and they're logical, it's like, well, comprehensive testing is going to increase the credibility of our program. So our graduates are going to be able to get better jobs, and it's going to be a better reflection for everybody. It's going to build up the status of our program, and it's going to benefit all of you. It's also going to help us get accredited or maintain our accreditation. So, because if we don't do this, all of our program is at a loss. It's not going to look good for you guys. What quality assurance? It's just like, hey, you know what? We want to make sure we're doing the best job for you. Whatever the reasons are, if they were good reasons, then people are thinking about it strongly, elaborating, and then it would lead to a more favorable attitude. Okay, your initial attitude can come into play here too. So think in terms of politics. If you have an ad that and the viewer agrees with the political position of the ad, that there are biases. And so they might say, elaborate and think about this. It's like, oh yeah, I really care about this candidate. You're making really good points here. And my thinking already, as I elaborate, I have biases in favor of the ad. Where there is a lot of research that says, okay, if a political ad comes on and it is against my viewpoints, I'm not necessarily going to be persuaded because my elaboration is going to be biased according to my own political filter. And so I might think through the points and counter-argue each one and shoot them down. So that's another, again, you're elaborating doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have a favorable result. It's not necessarily going to mean a more positive attitude. You as a persuader, if you go the central route, doesn't necessarily mean you're going to have persuasion. And in fact, it's harder to persuade through the central route because of these reasons. If you get people, don't think about this, look at this pretty colors, and by the way, buy a bag of Doritos. All right. But if you get into the game, you get into that central game, you gotta have your your game going, because people are going to be questioning you and counter arguing and have biases that they're going to be bringing into it. So it's a harder road to go. It's like building your house out of stone rather than sand. Peripheral route, you build a sand castle, wave comes and knocks it over. Flood comes, it's gone. But you go the central route, build it with a stone foundation, solid foundation. It's more difficult, but that attitude should stand the test of time and be more likely to cause behavior change. Okay, the next step. So, again, nature of processing, argument quality, initial attitudes could lead to more favorable thoughts or more unfavorable thoughts, depending on which way they go. And then, is there a change in cognitive structure? Okay, again, so this is where we're saying, is something happening inside where people's attitudes are starting to shift, beliefs are changing? Are you rehearsing your thoughts? You're going over it in your mind enough times that it really sets in and that it sticks? If yes, and it's favorable, then you might have a positive attitude change. It's like, all right, you persuaded me. And if it's yes, you're doing all these things, and it's like, yeah, I really, really, really hate this candidate now, or I'm definitely not going to buy this car, whatever it might be, then you still have a strong central route attitude shift, but in a negative direction. But what we care about, whether it's positive or negative, is what kind of attitude is this through central route versus the peripheral route. If your audience member, has put in all this effort to elaborate, then what is that central route attitude like? And you can probably by now guess it's kind of the opposite of what we said about the peripheral attitude change. That the attitude is changed changed attitude is relatively enduring. So if I've made this decision it's just like, okay, from now on I'm going to buy Toyota or Chevy vehicles because I've done my research, I've looked at the ads, my attitude has been changed. It might last a long time. I know for me personally, once I make a decision, sometimes I even forget all the thought processes and details, every little detail that led to that decision, but I'll remember that decision and I stick by it unless something gives me a good, strong reason to question it. Which leads to the next thing. It's resistant to counter-persuasion. If I've thought through this and people say, you know what, that computer that you were buying may not be the best, I'm like, all right, well, show me your stats. Why? It's like, and they go, hey, attractive spokesperson, looks like a smart person. I might go, I got better reasons than that, sorry. Or they might even start getting into the details. Well, look at the processor speed, look at the storage space, look at the type of graphics card. Again, I might consider it, but I'm going to be able to counter-argue with, well, did you know? With my computer that I want. And because of these things, research shows that it's more predictive of behavior. When it comes time to buy that car, buy that computer, I'm more likely to buy it, make a purchase in line with my attitude. Because I put that thought in, I'm more likely to vote for that candidate because I know why I'm doing it. So that is the Elaboration Likelihood Model. And again, look at the name, Elaboration Likelihood. How likely is somebody going to elaborate? Relevant message? Do they have the ability? True criteria, want to think about it? ability to think about it. If yes, then you're more likely to go central route. You got that hard row to hoe, but it's going to lead to a more stable attitude change. Or if you end up, not motivated, and you are motivated and you don't have the ability to think about it deeply, then the person is going to have possibly have a peripheral attitude change. And again, if it's peripheral and there's just no cue that's persuasive, or you go central and it's just like there's nothing in there that really makes me want to change my attitude either way, either strengthen it or reduce it, positive or negative, it's just not hitting me, then there is always that chance of no attitude change, just retaining the initial attitude. Here's another little arrow over here too. I guess I should just point out real quickly. If you're gone, you considered the message, but then it just doesn't stick, then you're back into peripheral route range again. It's like, okay, I still might be persuaded, but it's not because I have this attitude, cognitive structure that has become, encoded into my mind. I did the work, but something it hit the Teflon. So in that case, again, peripheral route. Anyway, that's the prominent dual route model of persuasion.